Well, welcome to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, and on podcast on all the major platforms. I'm Paul Smith. I'm one of the hosts of Food Farm Talk. The others are Emily Duncan and Abdul Rahim Abdullah. Today on Food Farm Talk on CFRU, we're talking to Thomas Benjoe. He's president and CEO of FHQ Developments in Saskatchewan, and we're talking about First Nations agriculture. They had a virtual conference back in September on Indigenous Agricultural Innovation. We're broadcasting here from the treaty lands of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation of the Anishnabe Nation. Please follow our podcast and our Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook accounts. So Indigenous people and agriculture have a very long history in Canada and on Turtle Island. The agricultural innovations from Indigenous peoples in the Americas transformed global agriculture after European contact. And European-style agriculture was promised as a means for livelihoods in the numbered treaties in Western Canada, only to be quickly subverted. Over the next couple of months, we'll be doing a series of shows on different aspects of Indigenous agriculture. So we're happy today to have Thomas Benjoe to talk more about First Nations agriculture. Morning, Thomas.
Paul.
Tanshi, Ani Buju. Can you briefly introduce yourself to the audience so listeners can understand something about you and your background?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. My name is Thomas Benjoe. I'm the president and CEO of FHQ Developments. I'm also a member of the Mesquite First Nation, which is Saulteaux community, but I'm also Cree and Dakota, represented here in the Treaty 4 territory. I guess some of the other titles I currently carry in the market here, I am the chair of the Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce, and have been helping to lead new initiatives in the business space and for the economy in Saskatchewan.
That's great. Good to hear. So many of our listeners are very unfamiliar with tribal councils and First Nations economic development. So can you talk a bit about FHQ Developments and the File Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council and how you do economic development work with all those Treaty 4 First Nations you were mentioning?
Absolutely, yeah. So so the Tribal Council, File Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council, is made up of 11 nations, and they're spread out throughout southern Saskatchewan, throughout the Treaty 4 territory. We're made up of 5 distinct tribes: the Dakota, Nakoda, Lakota, Cree, and Saulteaux communities. So there's 11 of those tribes that exist in the within our territory, and we represent about 16,000 plus Indigenous citizens from our tribal council. And the way that we work, so we're the development corporation, so we're the ECDev division of the tribal council. So our goal here is to build Indigenous wealth, which means Indigenous wealth is a little different. It actually means building community wealth and creating livelihood. And so that's the goal of our organization. So we're actually, we were formed back in 2010. And we have 3 distinct divisions inside of our organization. One is investments and partnerships. That's where we create all of our businesses. We manage our portfolio. The second division is economic development. So that's building the Indigenous business ecosystem around us and making sure that we share best business practices, but also support and help grow our nation's participation and our entrepreneurs' participation in the economy. And the third piece is our HR solutions. So it's called Dakota HR Solutions. And so that focuses on growing Indigenous talent, both in our companies and for customers in the market, so that we're keeping track of all the Indigenous professionals that are growing as we grow as a business. And so that makes up our organization. So we're invested in quite a number of different industries, from mining, oil and gas, hospitality, tech, and now making our way into agriculture.
So the conference you had back in September, the virtual conference, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what your goals were for that and how you intend to follow up on that. And as I told you before, I think it was a really great event and very timely. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about that and the follow-up.
Sure. Well, the goal of the conference was to get our nations and our entrepreneurs and ourselves ready for the opportunity in the Saskatchewan market. We have the protein supercluster that is situated here in Regina. We also have a lot of major investments that are happening throughout our territory. So, new crushing plants are being invested in. Expansion of value add organizations are being invested in within the territory, and so we want to be able to take advantage of that. And so we wanted to change the way that our nations are perceiving agriculture, because typically a lot of our ag conferences that we've attended in the past have all been focused on being producers. So either we're producing crops or we're raising livestock. A lot of our communities, have buffalo or bison, and we wanted to expose them to here's some new opportunities to start to think about. And being that we're an organization that's already in tech, we are looking at investments and ag tech and looking at some of the entrepreneurs we have in our backyard here. For ourselves as an organization, we're not invested in tech yet. We have taken the time to develop an ag criteria paper in terms of what we think we're going to invest in and what we're willing to invest in and how much risk we're willing to take. And so we've developed that. But one of the things I realized early on was that we actually need to go back and work on the foundation. How do we make sure that we have success in the ag sector by setting the right foundation? So when I look at the other industries that we're involved in, there's a foundation that's set. There's a relationship that's built with a lot of the major mines, gas, pipeline, just with customers and government in general. Now, from an ag perspective, a lot of these organizations don't have Indigenous engagement strategies or Indigenous procurement policies. And so we have to go back, build those relationships and build that foundation of support. That way, when we do make investments and start to align our businesses, we'll have a lot more success and a lot more support going forward.
Yeah, it's a good plan to plan your strategy first. So you were talking earlier before the interview about how you plan to follow up on the conference with workshops and smaller events.
Yeah, so we are going to take snippets of the conference and actually expand them a little bit more. So we are going to look at forums and other webinars where we will bring in additional expertise, and we'll just elaborate a bit more on what we heard through the conference, and begin bringing our nations along with us on this journey of these are the things to think about, and here are some of the key players in the market that we've been working with, and they become a great resource for us to begin building those relationships. And
good, yeah, that's great. So at your conference, one of the presentations was Chief Cadmus Delorme of Cowsliss First Nation, and he laid out that colonial history that denied the First Nations development in agriculture, despite the promises in Treaty 4 and others. He also laid out how those policies still hold First Nations to ag development back. And he talked about some of the successes on his own First Nation and building the crop and livestock businesses there. So maybe you could tell our listeners briefly about some of those constraints and how they've impeded First Nations investment in agriculture and agribusiness. As you say, it's a broader value network and chains, and how you're trying to overcome those constraints.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues we have, if we are looking for investment on reserve, If we're going to leverage the land that we have, obviously Indian Act doesn't allow us to have security based on the land, nor do we have securities in place for if we do purchase any equipment, right? So there are sections of the Indian Act that won't allow, creditors to come and seize assets that are on reserve. And so, there's different things that need to be created in order for that to happen effectively. But in most cases, in terms of, an entrepreneur or an individual farmer that wants to get started in the community, they have to basically cash flow their entire operations, which means, they're not getting the best equipment in the market because they can't get a loan to be able to do that. So there's, I think from what you would have heard from, Cowsis and what they're doing, they've had to leverage the community to be able to access, funding for larger pieces of equipment in order for them to get started. So there's the Indian Act plays, a pretty or creates a very critical issue for us in being able to access capital.
So, yeah, Chief Cabinet identified Section 88, even. He was very specific in the Indian Act that prevented using First Nations reserve land because it's nominally Crown land as a basis for loans from commercial institutions, and that being a constraint on investment. And this is an issue across Canada, and I know I've heard this expressed, and I read about this being an issue in terms of at Six Nations south of Guelph here near Brantford. That lack of access to capital was a real constraint on the development of agriculture there. And he kind of implied that some of that is the creditors and the financial institutions just not understanding how to do it, but there's also the legal constraints. So, and maybe this is out of scope, but do we need, is that an amendment to the Indian Act that needs to be made, or something to be taken out of the Indian Act? I know that's a big topic, of course, Indian Act, but that's sort of like these are all the specific things that would help economic development, right? So I guess there's two aspects. So there's the specifics of should we change the Indian Act related to, and also the banking industry, do they just need to be made aware of how to work with what's already there?
Yeah, I think, changing the Indian Act itself, I mean, even if we're just changing one section, there's a lot of effects that would happen on other areas that, might not be seen immediately. So there is, an issue in that process. So, what I would encourage, and why we had, our panel of financial experts was to begin discussing, well, what can we do as financial institutions? I'm a former commercial banker. I know what the loan losses actually look like for on-reserve lending, and it's actually very, very low compared to other industries. And so, what I think, we need to start thinking about, either, through federal programs or provincial programs, or even just with the financial institutions themselves, is be willing to take a little bit more risk, be willing to look at security in a different way, but, consider, what the loan losses actually will be in those communities, because a lot of times like I said, the loan losses are actually very, very low when you're lending to First Nations. A little unknown fact that I know people aren't aware of, but it's something that I've been able to experience, working with nations and their finances.
Now, there are a number of Indigenous and Aboriginal and First Nations and Métis financing institutions in different provinces. And I know in Ontario, we have the Indian Agriculture Program of Ontario is specifically formulated to do financing for First Nations agriculture. What role do those, and I know Saskatchewan at least one or two of those. And so what role do they play in helping kind of move this forward in terms of agribusiness development for First Nations?
Yeah, I think, a lot of the capital that they get to lend out to communities does come through federal funding as well. But I think, what needs to change is we've been doing loans the same way for, decades, and we actually needed to change. When I look at our organization early on, when we were trying to access these same loans, they're very limited in terms of, well, how much can I borrow, and knowing that the egg industry, $100,000 doesn't go very long ways when you're buying $500,000 equipment, right? And then, that's not even including the inputs and a number of other things that you need to factor in. So when you think about the programs that exist, a lot of them are limited in the amount of capital they're able to lend. And in some cases, if you're going over and above some of the programs, well, then you get into the lending piece, which lending rates are oftentimes very, very high interest rates, which, it's a little difficult. We know what it's like to be in the egg sector and for things to go up and down very quickly. And for you to have to pay back a very, very high interest rate, well, you're essentially setting up that business for failure, or that farm for failure, because we need to have interest rates that are still competitive, that we can manage risk accordingly within the business. So there's things like that need to change. And then even when we think about the programs themselves, a lot of times they're focused purely on capital. And so we're interested in tech, which means, well, we're not actually spending on capital, we're spending on people. We're spending the development, or the asset is the people that we're developing to do our businesses. I can't go and take a loan and be expected to only spend it on capital, because I'm only going to buy, $10,000 worth of computers, and that's it. Everything else is invested in people and upskilling and making sure that they have the accreditations necessary, and building in the back of the house tech or software to be able to deliver. So there's a lot of things that I think we need to work on changing. And I think, having another look at the policy and reinvigorating what that needs to look like going into the future, and thinking about where, as nations, where we're going, we need them to think a little bit more broad, and be willing to take on a little bit more risk on new ventures that don't fit the traditional lending model.
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads into sort of the whole kind of expertise and labor market part of this too, because you've been talking about that, is so for agriculture and agribusiness and value added, the specialized expertise is needed. And there was, at your conference, with some lots of, like Melissa Archon spoke about, a lot of that soil science related stuff and the technology involved in that. And then there was talk of, First Nations agrologists involved in that. And so that's the expertise needed. And as you said, and so maybe you can talk a bit about that, how you develop the First Nations expertise for these kind of business ventures that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think, starting early and being able to expose our nations to, and our youth to future opportunities and future careers, that's going to be very critical. And that's why, as an organization or as a development corporation, a lot of the community reinvestment that we do is always focused on youth. And so how do we get youth aware of opportunities? How do we build brand awareness with them so that they can see careers for themselves with us? How do we get them following what we're doing as an organization? These are all the things that, we're setting up as a foundation and a basis. And then, we have our scholarship programs that, will help to, that we can navigate and support our youth into very specific careers that we're going to need in the future. But I think, one of the other things that I know we talk about agriculture, and we're very, very good at doing it as a science. But if you actually have a look at our institutions across Canada, we actually don't teach ag as a business. Now you can go and take a look at every single one of the business schools across Canada, and I haven't found one yet that is specifically focused on agriculture. Now, when I look at my educational background, I went to First Nations University of Canada, and I got a very specialized business background in Indigenous business, Indigenous economic development, and Indigenous governance. So my background is very, very unique. And so if we were to start to distinguish, what do we need to know from an ag perspective, and how do we build programs so that our youth in business can now start becoming, more broader thinking professionals in the ag space. So I think there's some evolution that needs to happen there as well. That we do need to mix perhaps some of the sciences with the business programs and start developing these ag business leaders. And if we could do that for some of our First Nations youth that are going into business programs and see themselves in the ag industry, perfect. That's a great investment that we can make, and will help us create a more competitive market for agriculture.
Following the same kind of train of thought, there is a lot changing with respect to Indigenous people's opportunities in agriculture. The federal Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has new programs directed to Indigenous peoples, as do some provinces. And then we just, a little while ago, the Farm Management Canada released an analysis of how we need to change things to improve opportunities for First Nations and Métis people in agriculture. And so how do you see those kind of developments? Do you see them as helpful and, or not enough, or I'd just like to hear your perspective?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at some of the, recent federal funding that was made available for Indigenous communities or businesses, if you have a look at the reports, they were extremely over subscribed, which means there was a lot more opportunity than there was capital made available to them. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we know the cost of participating in ag, right? And, like I said, a piece of equipment could be $500,000 here. So, how are we making sure that we're investing enough? And how are we ensuring that we're investing in, building capacity and building the foundation for success for those Indigenous businesses that are getting involved in the ag industry to be more successful. So I think we need to probably invest a little more, but I think what we need to really understand and what would be helpful to us as Indigenous communities would be what are the goals of the federal programs or even the provincial programs that are going to be created, and how do they align with the ag industry and the opportunities, and how do we make sure that we're aligning the businesses that we're creating with that strategy so that we can be a part of that more direct investment and growth. So I think that's where we need to all get on the same page and really focus how we do that successfully.
So maybe we'll finish up with a more general question about what are the kind of developments and trends that you see in the future for development in First Nations agriculture and agribusiness, and maybe beyond that to economic development.
Well, I can speak to our territory here and the relationships that we're building with a lot of the larger players in the markets and the AGTs, the Viteras. Building those relationships with those organizations help to give us a better sense of what some of their needs may be in the future, and how we're able to be a part of the value chain of what they do as an organization. And the way that we view investment here is, we make these little investments in businesses so that we can leverage that and take the profits from those businesses and invest into something larger. And so we keep leveraging and reinvesting our capital into other ventures so that we can, eventually build much larger businesses. So that's what we're focused on as an organization. I think that's where, there is a tremendous amount of opportunity, and, it would allow us to be able to take a bit more risk in the types of investments that we do make. So, we look at the tech sector, and like I said, we're involved in the tech sector already, and we're quite excited about, seeing some of the local entrepreneurs across Saskatchewan that are, creating ag-related technologies. And, I want to be able to invest in those, but we need some pretty serious capital to be able to do that. And so just getting our foot in the door and leveraging up, building some businesses at the start, and eventually raising enough capital to invest into these other more riskier ventures will be how we manage our portfolio going forward. And with all of this experience that we're building as a development corporation, we'll share in those best practices, we'll share through the forums, share through the webinars, and make sure that we're bringing other nations on the journey with us, and making sure that they don't have to go through some of the tough learnings that we're gonna be through. We'll be able to lead the dips and learn the tough lessons, but hopefully make things a lot easier for them when they begin to invest in the sector.
Well, we'll wrap it up there, and I really want to thank you, Thomas, for coming on the show today. Miigwech, hey, for being part of this and helping us share the great work you did on the conference, and for your people in Saskatchewan. It's great.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks for allowing me to share what we're learning. And this is always evolving, so always excited to share. And I know, a year from now, and 3 and 5 years from now, this strategy will continue to evolve, and hopefully we're back at some point in time telling you all about the new businesses.
Yeah, successes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks to all the listeners on CFRU 93.3 FM in Guelph and on podcast. Check out the links in our show notes for some more information on what Thomas has been talking about, and also on our social media feeds. So please tune in again for another episode of Food Farm Talk.